calm. There you go. Hello, and welcome to the stream. This is Floating Poly, or really, this one's going to be actually kind of short. The great reason for that is we're just going to go ahead and evaluate the project I finished. So this is Sakuya Izayoi, a character I've been working on for a good while, probably about 5 months, and we made it for the rookie's deadline, which was 1st of June, actually. So I want to try and do a little bit of introspective and retrospective on things that I think went well and things that didn't quite go as well as I wanted. And hopefully some stuff that I'll be able to learn from, and also what the kind of next steps are going to be for future projects and stuff. So let's see. Okay, just gonna take a bit of my drink here. So I'm pretty sure I've linked the actual project in the description. You can have a look at that if you want this all in, more glorious detail. I say glorious, but hey, I think it actually works pretty well. What we've got here. So this is the character in the Marmoset toolbag engine. So at the moment we've got fast rendering on, because I imagine as soon as I untick this button, it's probably going to have a really bad connection. So I think we'll leave it. And if you want to see like the actual truly highest quality render, you'll have to go to ArtStation. Maybe we'll try it near the end, but let's try and get through most of this first. So the character is fully posed, fully lit, and we even took the time to make some not amazing knives, but just get it done for the deadline kind of knives. When we look at up close, we really do see the cost of that fast rendering there. In that, obviously, I'm able to move the view around quite easily, but it doesn't have anywhere near the same kind of effects in terms of the rendering and such. This is on a 2070 Super, so if I were to take this off, it wouldn't exactly go very slowly, but it's slow enough to probably warrant me not turning it on, as I've said before. So yeah, like I say, if you want the actual full quality render, you'll have to go to ArtStation, but this is good enough to be able to evaluate it anyway. In particular, for the pose, I'll try and quickly find the reference for it, but I took a reference from a piece of fan art that I did end up finding on the Googles, basically. I can't find the actual source as to who drew it or where it came from, which is a little unfortunate. But apparently I didn't save it either. It's a bit unfortunate. Well, okay. If I find it, I'll tweet about it. But basically, the pose is very similar to this whole dynamic. I think the only things that were kind of missing from it are these sort of the way these ribbons come and go, and the direction that Sakuya is looking in. I feel that is quite a dramatic pose, actually, and you get a lot of sort of this striking kind of form, and the extended sort of how everything's kind of extended out like that, except the arms here. So everything kind of points in this kind of direction towards the left. And I like the dramatic lighting that I've got here. In that we've got this really sort of strong red light, not too strong. I don't want it to be too to consume the whole piece, but just enough to accent things. Because anyone who knows Sakuya knows that she serves Vermilia Scarlet, and Vermilia is of course associated with the whole the red moon and everything. And on the right side, we've got some cool lighting, cool blue rim lighting. So we get basically 2 rim lights on top of our sort of key and sort of fill lights. So when we look at this scene, and we just see the absolutely ridiculous number of lights and the ridiculous number of cameras. So I find that when I organize renders in that way, not in terms of the folders here apparently, but I organize the lights so that they're all, so they're, at the very least the lights are in their folder. I mean, I don't mind so much the having to, like, you know, pick and peck at them, but you know, that aspect is fine. And if I just kind of hide the cameras away, or at least most of them, this main camera is just the actual camera that you start with. We'll get to that in a second, but as you can see, there's a lot of lights. I think there's about, what, 20? And that's one of the reasons why, if I were to take fast rendering off, it renders so much slower. We're talking like 30 FPS or something, and some quite big GPU or CPU overhead, right? Because there's a lot of calculation going on, and of course global illumination and whatnot. You know, basically very processor intensive light setup. But one of the things that I followed from an artist called Balvo is basically that you paint with light. So the whole concept of like 3-point lighting, that is to say a key light, a fill light, and then a rim light, is taken here, but with a lot of liberty. So in the sense that if we were to boil this down, we actually have more like key and fill lights ambiguously, right? You can't really say whether or not there is like a key light or a fill light, but what you can see are 2 rim lights, and these rim lights are defined by multiple big kind of rim lights here. So big, powerful lights that are basically catching onto the surface. Again, on the other side where we've got, you know, just blue lights that are simply pointing towards small areas, right? And I wanted to try and only go for small kind of areas where the light is supposed to catch onto the edge, but where the light then bleeds out, so to speak, from the edge and to the, you know, the main bases, so to speak. I find that difficult to explain. So what I'm basically saying is that I've got very powerful lights that are far away and cover, you know, basically trying to get the actual rim light on there, and then on the tangent to that, so basically from over here to here, which would be like 90 degrees, I've actually got more blue lights that are on a smaller sort of intensity, and they're just sort of meant to extend that across a bit. So basically it just causes some gradient of light from the rim to the front in this case. And the same is true kind of the back where the red light is, but there aren't any sort of lead lights, so to speak. I really want this light to only really be showing as much as this back angle will really allow. I don't want it to bleed across because red is a very contrasting color here. Well, kind of, in that it would basically turn this part of the model basically purple, and it already bleeds well enough as it is, I think. So, okay. What else? What else? Yeah. The last thing I think I'll talk about in terms of the presentation, in terms of light and camera work, is exposure. So, I've got this camera right now, which admittedly is just called Main 1, and this has some settings in it that I've played with, and this then serves as the settings for all of these cameras. You know, so all of these in this group all have these settings except for ones that are labeled wire. Basically all that is just that the depth of field isn't enabled on these wire cameras. It's just so that they can capture wireframes, and blurring the wireframe may not be in our best interest, so that's that. But most of these cameras, if we were to go into, say, camera 2 or even camera 5, and they're all set at particular angles, and they're all locked. So they are basically set up as render cameras that I then cannot mess with or accidentally move around or change. And I think this lock also applies to these post-process effects as well, I think. I'm not 100% on that. But these post-process effects here, basically just increasing the exposure, the contrast by a little bit. That particularly makes for a striking image when we compare it to the current main camera, so to speak, which is where it started from. And when you look at it like this, it's actually very, very contrasting. Like the contrast between is it camera 5? Right, yeah, so camera 5 here, like that's a very, very vivid image. But when we look at the main camera, which I believe has only the default settings on, not even that, so this actually has some increase, but not a lot. Some grain, some sharpening, but not enough, not nearly enough. And I suppose if I were to create a new camera, add object, camera, right? This is it when on a completely defaulted camera, and you see just how much changing the exposure and the contrast had, and the tone mapping had actually as well had made so much of a difference, right? Even switching to a different tone mapper, creates a lot of contrast already, and we can increase the exposure. We're already pretty close to what the result that we had. Increase the contrast a little bit. I think it was 0.6 there. Exposure, contrast, and that's pretty close. If we look at camera 5, there's a little bit more vividness here, but it's not down to saturation. It's purely down to having much more exposure, yeah, and maybe some sharpness. So go back to camera 10. Yep. Oh well, now the exposure's all already there, so there must be another setting in here. Now, presume that it is maybe sharpness. Strength 0, limit 2, 3. No. Okay. Maybe it's the exposure type. No. Oh, it's because I've not selected it. Camera 5 here. Yep, there we go. So, yeah, it is definitely locked. So this is on exposure of 3.2, contrast of 0.3 or 0.003. Contrast center was moved. So the contrast center, if I recall right, then controls the where this contrast actually is. It doesn't seem to be making much of a difference though with that. That's fine. And there's just a slight bit of saturation increase. Yeah, that's exactly what I thought. He says. So when I increase the saturation as well. So this is a much more interesting and basically popping image than what we had in the original setting, or even this improvised setting. And then we go to the default, by making a completely new camera. Yeah, it's so much different. It is very, very different when working with just the default camera. So you want to definitely play with the tone mapping of the subject that you're lighting, because sometimes it really isn't enough, and you do have to play around with that. So yep, much more vivid there. So that's pretty cool. So then onto the things that they actually like. Well, I think we can actually start talking about what I actually like and dislike, as opposed to this sort of end process here that I've been discussing for a little bit. So I like the pose. I like that it's quite dynamic and flowy. So it suggests that there's maybe wind blowing, I would say, and she's focused on something over there, right? So he has clear focus. There is emotion, although it's kind of hard to see on the quick setting here. But on the ArtStation renders, you'll find that the expression is quite clear. So the hair, in concept and in some level of execution, like just the fact that it's flowing like this, I find is quite good at conveying, you know, a certain like attitude of a character, and the way that all of this is posed really does work. I'm particularly proud of the way that this has been executed. It was much quicker than I thought it was going to go, and was much less painful than I thought it was. In actuality, a lot of my pain was actually around over here. We'll get into that. But the result is okay, I would say. The result here, the fact that it's all, you know, sort of responds to this, you know, kind of wind, like suggests that there is like wind blowing. I think that works out pretty well. So I also particularly like the way that this curves. So the way these ribbons curve and form this sort of like shape here. So all of the what you get when you sort of squint is that you get this sort of, you know, thin form, and then you get this gigantic lower form here, which of course has loads of negative spaces in that then define the skirt, the legs, and such. It's a very, I think it's a very, very cool thing. So, what else have we got? Yeah. I do like the painting as well on some of this, but I think there are areas where it could have been pushed a little bit further. I guess we'll get into that as well. And just the way that like certain shapes have been basically rendered, certain like gradients and such have been painted in. I think that's worked out pretty well as well. All right. And I guess like over here, particularly on this angle and this lighting, this gets defined really, really well, I think. This is a little bit extreme, and I don't think you would necessarily be tiptoeing on your high heels. I think that might be a bit difficult, but I think that it lends itself to strengthening the pose and exaggerating. But yeah, I particularly like the way that I've done this sort of AO painting here, so we really see the way that the like I guess the leather casing really like overlaps this sort of second inner leather layer, so to speak. And it's particularly striking here as well, where there's less light. You get loads of contrast there. Okay. Right, so things from this render that I think could have needed a lot of improvement. Like me personally speaking. I think that there are some issues over on the hair when looked at closely, and I think it's caused by something that we'll go into when we talk about like the ZBrush execution. But as we can see, like we've got some substance painter like lines that are drawn in here, and it's a cool method. But one problem that it has is that you're not necessarily accurate to what the high poly actually is. So here, for instance, you've got this line that comes in and then is broken up around this sort of area. The reason is for this is because it's a completely new mesh there, right? But that's not what the line says. This line says that this should be, you know, this should be a form here, but it is not, because these two are completely separate. So we've got in place the detail there that contradicts the actual makeup of this mesh here. So that shouldn't have been there. And I think that, and we'll go into this when we get to the ZBrush portion, but basically we have to if the high poly is basically the be all and end all, then Substance Painter kind of has to follow with it and not attempt to define its own methodology there. So in other words, Substance Painter has to convey the high poly model and not attempt to necessarily create something too ambitious in its material, right? So Substance Painter should be focused very much on its material rather than trying to define actual tangible forms from where they don't exist. So like they might look fine in Substance Painter's flat view or even in the render view, but when in the actual like game engine, forms are forms and hard edges are hard edges. So yeah, it is completely betrayed by the hard edge here, which is as a result of the fact that they are two completely different meshes. And the way I guess to go around this is to simply, just don't try to merge things that aren't even merged that way. So gotta be super careful with that. There are some like curvature. There are like some issues here as well, where like these two are all one mesh. Sorry, so this whole section is one mesh, and it is kind of problematic because it's this part where these then have to break off. This has a particular like issue which is caused by this part that stretches because it's being manipulated in a different way to the rest of the mesh. So you get these sort of like weird forms and weird bends in there that I don't think should be there. I mean, far away, even in far away, I can still see that. So I think that this is going to introduce a very different methodology to the way I go ahead and do hair in this way. And it's going to be something that I plan on streaming actually in the near future. So I have an idea and I want to be able to try and demonstrate it. Now, move on to the back, and I think that there's some areas here that do particularly suffer, mostly being because these areas are merged. And okay, looking at it now, it's not immensely bad, but you still get these like areas where things are basically being pulled apart because, of course, one strand wants to go one way and another wants to go the opposite way. So the part where they're merged then becomes problematic both to skin and also to basically getting them to interact is just very painful. And if all of these were like one piece, then it might be a bit easier. But at the same time, you introduce problems where you're now using way more geometry than you need to. So a bit of a double-edged sword there. So, but apart from that, if we look at it from the front view like this, it's not too bad. It's still a little bit like gated, like say here, whoops, our name, like over here, where it's kind of just sort of very sharply turns. This I think could have been prevented by just like relaxing the skinning a little bit more. It's a little bit 1-1 right now. So just relaxing some of the skinning there, I think would have gone a long way. And finally, the last thing is that the anisotropic map works reasonably well from the front, but it does not work particularly well on the back. Now, the reason for this is because, at least from what I understand anyway, the front is made up of very simple, very downward meshes, and they tend to get unwrapped in this way. Well, we can probably look at the UVs in a bit, but the basic gist of it is that these all kind of map kind of straight down very easily. They don't have like kinks and turns and stuff. So you get a pretty reasonably straight anisotropic highlight here. But on the back, we don't have that. And I did theorize that breaking them up from one mesh into 3 meshes, like this, 1, 2, 3, would make this a little bit more palatable. And it did. It's better than what it had, but it's still very, kind of unpredictable in its movement. And I theorize the reason for that is because the UVs are just simply not straight. And they need to be. Even with this wavy kind of look in the hair, the UVs basically need to be like very rigid. We're talking practically blocks, which is going to be an interesting experiment in the future. I want to see how far it can be pushed and what's going to happen when I try this out. But yeah, I think that when I've done it this way, I've basically I've sealed myself into a dark room with it, because you know, yeah, they're all mapped downwards, but they don't map exactly in a sort of a one-to-one way. Like they don't map into like a square form. So we'll see about that. I'll put a link in like a Twitter result, like a Twitter post that I found that I think will help improve it actually. So we'll put a link in the description sooner or later, but not right now. One area that it did really work on, though, somehow, is the braid. Now, I don't know why, but it just seems to be okay. Like, I can't see any real issue here, but that's another thing that I want to really try with this workflow that I'm going to have, is that a small, complicated thing like a braid is not normally mapped or unwrapped in a very, you know, by the block way. So I think this one's going to be really interesting, how it's going to go. I think it's going to involve a lot of like reuse though. We'll see. But that's one thing that this all does accomplish though, is that all of these pieces, besides the fact that some of these mirror across, are uniquely mapped. So this braid, for instance, every segment has its own UV data. When using a more like organized UV layer, you can run into an issue where you reuse so much that you can't differentiate from the forms. And what I mean by that basically is that when you reuse UVs, those UVs can only have like those forms can only have the UV data that they're given. So if, say for instance, all of these all had the same UV space, right? So every one of these, like, you know, strands had to be mapped to this, they were all mapped to the same thing. Then if you put like one strand or something on one of them, they would all get a strand. So to differentiate that, you'd have to then put them on their own UV island, right? So I guess that's an interesting balance. So, but the thing with this kind of hair is that they need to have their own information. That's what sets them apart and makes them distinct. With like more realistic hair, where the actual hair itself is so small and thin that you can't really tell if you're reusing it or not, unless you're particularly like if like you're using only one hair card or something, that could be a problem. But I think a good balance would be, you know, mirror if possible. Elements like, you know, pieces like this should definitely get their own UV space. And then something like a braid, maybe these individual things could be reused, or no. I don't know. I'm going to find that one really interesting to see how I'm going to do this. If the next character has a braid, we'll see. Particularly like small braids like this, not like a large braid, like if you were to see, I don't know, some particularly extravagant anime characters that have giant braids. So that's that whole area leads on to another problem, which I've received in some feedback that we'll get into, but some feedback indicates that the head, or maybe even the hair, is actually too large and causes a proportional issue on the character. It's potentially possible that they might be right. If, like, I try to bend, say, the arm above her head, there is some difficulty there. Even with using the shoulder control to lift it a little further, it's still kind of difficult to get her arms over her head like an actual person could. It's just a little bit awkward. So, you know, maybe that is potentially true, in that this is too high, or that the head is too tall and the hair is too scales out too far, basically. So it may just be a case that all of this has to be scaled in a bit. Because this project's done, we can't really like touch it anymore, or rather I won't. And instead I think that it would be a good idea to just basically commit this kind of feedback to the next model. So, you know, when we go to model the next character, we're going to try not to make it too big, but we'll see. So, okay. Anything else that I see here that I don't particularly like? Not so much over on the lower half, lower area of the body. But I guess one thing is that there is no so-called tertiary detail on this character apart from, say, the tights here. But this isn't particularly strong. And I think that there's, like, I wanted to try and do a bit of, like, simple kind of fabric on it. Like a simple kind of ribbed fabric. But I think they really did need an actual texture as opposed to a scaled anisotropic texture. It may have needed some more noise on this as well, just to get some more variation. And perhaps there should have been noise across more of the model. So, and the way that I can determine that, why I think that it needs more noise, is if I were to go to the play render instead, and thankfully it's still got the quick view, I think. Let's see. Oh yeah, there we go. So I'm on the clay render now. Okay, so this is just basically that the albedo has been removed. That's it. And the whole model is just sort of a grey. Now when we look at the actual lighting information, even with normal mapping, there's still sort of like a chunkiness to it, which is not particularly desirable in my eyes. So I guess one of the ways to eliminate that is to have some added noise onto the model. You know, you can see that it works pretty well in areas like this, but where areas of light just start overlapping each other, it can lead to a slightly weird appearance. So I think the way to prevent that is to have some kind of, you know, texture noise or tertiary detail kind of thing. But I didn't really use any because it was a bit, it felt like a bit much, but maybe it was something that I needed to pursue a little bit harder, try and find something that would break this up a bit and also, you know, not exaggerate too far. Okay, so that's basically my main point in terms of this render. So, we could perhaps move to ZBrush, right? No, like, I might as well have the model here as well, just for comparison. Yeah, we'll leave it on the clay render. Actually, that's pretty good. While we're there, we'll just hide. There's that. Nope. It doesn't hide the icons. Okay, that's fine. We can hide the cameras, though. Or maybe I have to group them very quickly though. Does it put them in the group? It does. That's great. All right, cool. So here's our like clay render, which is a little bit right on the leg here as well. That's probably the only issue. Oops. And over here, I've got the ZBrush model. So I think the areas on the ZBrush model, areas that went really well. This braid, I think, works pretty well. It was constructed just using a simple brush, which you can look at on the art station. It's very simple, and you could learn how to make that very quickly on the ZBrush workshops. Like, it's no issue at all. But you know, in terms of the actual sculpting of it, each one of these basically is unique, which is great. But they are also a lot of work. I remember that retopologizing this braid was at least a day, if not more, of work, because since they were all individually formed, you know, bit of a problem. So to actually make this efficient, you'd have to actually go in and put down every single little polygon in there. It was not particularly pleasant. You know, particularly because it's like I didn't cheap out on the braid form actually. If we look at the braid itself actually on here, and that's what this like dual view is actually very useful for. Every every one of these segments was individually modeled. right? We didn't cheap out and like use a cylinder lattice or something. Every part of it was defined, for better or for worse, right? So we've got like the way that that curves up and down like that, which results in that form here, that form here. Basically, like, you know, it's as close as possible to being both efficient and also considerate of the actual forms. It's just that it took a long time to retopologize it, and I don't think it's something I can escape just by using the lowest subdiv. The reason for that, of course, being that, you know, braids tend to be made with very, very long trails of meshes that literally interweave with each other. It is a literal braid. So making the low poly for this is, you know, a lot more pain, actually. And, you know, you don't really get the anisotropic aspect of it either. So, you know, it doesn't quite behave the same way. So that's one to think about. You'll also notice on here, right, if we select one of these, and you can tell that it's selected like that, these are actually one subtool, but Shift F reveals that they are separate groups within this subtool. Now, it actually does work in that we can then use like sculpting to make it make them appear to merge with each other by using the H polish brush, and that does work. And in areas like this, over here on this fringe, it actually does work fairly well. Until you zoom in too close and start seeing the pixels. You know, that's actually fine. You know, so I'm not too mad about that, but it might still be worth seeking a new sort of workflow where these are actual separate pieces that are unwrapped basically in this ZBrush stage, so that they can use their own UV data. So I'm just going to take a drink here as well. So, oops, not meant to accidentally sculpt on this. So I want to try something where these are more individual pieces and potentially have reusable sort of UV data. Now, I don't mean reusable in the way of saying that the UVs are going to overlap, but I do mean in that if this was made with say a brush that has like anime hair pieces in it, and these pieces are already unwrapped, and it's just a case of, you know, putting them down and then manipulating them afterwards, there is a risk that, you know, there's a lack of efficiency in terms of polygons, but it would speed the process up immensely, and there would also be a speed up in terms of the unwrapping because, you know, they're already unwrapped. So all you'd have to do is then separate out the actual shells. That could work. Not super efficient, but it could make for a good model. We'll have to see. Alright, so there's that. And I would apply the same logic to the back here as well. In this case, it is also, I think, the same. Actually, they're all one piece, but they have their own individual poly frames. Sorry, their own poly groups. One part that was particularly annoying, though, was where they merge at the top. That was actually very annoying to retopologize much more than expected, just because of the fact that they were separate, but then the pieces here didn't quite separate. So you see how they're actually like merged like this, and they're all converging like that. But when you actually look at an individual piece on this, so maybe like this, There you go. Sorry, did I just forget how to hide objects? There we go. So you see how these make this form, but then they meet in the middle, but they don't complete. So that's a bit of a problem, because if they don't complete and merge here, then when you go to mirror it, it's going to be problematic for one of two reasons. Either your Maya mesh merges, and so you completely lose what's supposed to be happening in the middle, or you don't merge them and then you have to clean them up, which is pretty problematic. On this actual model, you can see that what we do is that they meet here, but then they cross over like this, right? And when we projected them in the marmoset like texture baking, what we do is that all of the mirrored components are basically missing, so that they can take this this texture and projection. It actually works very well. It's just that it's a bit of a pain. Hopefully there are some things that we can try and do to get the same result, but with less annoying work. Just try and make it more efficient. And then obviously, in the case of the lower layer, so if we were to go through and find the lower layer, you can see if I were to find this piece as well, this one, there we go, you see that they don't even meet at all, because they're already covered by the upper layer. It's not likely that the camera is going to look over there, so no issues there. But it's just this top part that was a little bit harder than expected. Alright then. Okay, so with that said, let me just get that. There you go. Okay, there is enough about that. Now, what I want to try and doing as well for next time is that this is actually already a working base mesh, which is fine and all, but it would be quite nice if this was unwrapped. It's not unwrapped right now, but perhaps it would be cool if this was unwrapped for the next model that comes along. And what I would do then is that, since it's already, it's already polygrouped as well, which is great. This is a base mesh that I've worked on just by reworking one of the characters that I had. This actually works really well. It's just now, if I take it that step further and give it a UV unwrap, then what we can do is, if we take it down to the lowest subdiv, right, this gives us the starting of maybe a game ready model. Maybe it just needs a few more polygons here, and the lips, for instance, it's not quite there yet. But if we give it a little bit more work, and have an option for, actual nostril characters, so not necessarily anime characters, that wouldn't exactly be hard. We already have one. But if we, change that, that'd be alright. Maybe after we unwrap all of this other stuff up. But if we, let's not control one. If we look at the actual makeup of the original, it's all already there, and it's all poly framed, apart from, feet. So if we have like a character with sandals or something, we could do that extra work as well. What I'm finding is that a lot of this is actually like, it doesn't have to all be done in one go. A lot of this can be adaptable, and you can work on stuff, up to a point where you need it, and then when you need another aspect, you can just work on that base again. And I'm liking that a lot. So, if I were to take all of this, unwrap it, make this into basically a game ready kind of mesh, then things I think would become a lot easier from retopologizing. I mean, most of this is actually pretty okay. Obviously, there's a lot of sort of used polys, so to speak, here, but deleting is a lot easier than adding, right? Deleting these edge loops here where they're not necessary, or cordoning them off, to reduce polycounts in the back of the head is not difficult at all. And if the the UVs get messed up a little bit, that's hardly a problem. It's a small correction. If you go ahead and do something that gets you 80% of the work done, you can't really moan that it then doesn't do 100%, I guess, when the result you had before was that you had to do all the work anyway, so it gave you 0%. So that's I did find quite a bit of success in using aspects of this to do base meshes as well. Like the legs definitely helped. All I had to do with this was to export basically up to here, because that's where most of the leg was required, to then eliminate the topology that I didn't need. So if I look on here, right, although it's a little bit bright, I can just turn that down a little bit, or get the albedo on. I think it's this one. Yeah, there we go. So when we look at this, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. What, 12? That sort of ring here is 12 polygons. I think it's the same here. Yeah, it is. So most of that did get reused and then like smoothed across the original leg. There may be some edge loops that were kind of taken out, but that's a lot less work than trying to retopologize this whole leg. I mean, it might look better if you go ahead and do like a manual retopology session, but this I think works pretty well. In some cases, maybe even there needs to be more definition, but for now, like this aspect, this result isn't too bad. So being able to reuse this leg really did save quite a bit of time. Would be nice as well, I've had a conversation with someone, like I gave an answer to them where I think I said that actually, you know what, like hands probably aren't that hard to retopologize. So if you already have a hand that's got good topology from the get-go in ZBrush, then reusing the lowest subdiv for that then makes that a bit more, cakewalk, I guess. I mean, there wasn't anything particularly different about the topology here in this hand, but in fact, I can't remember if I reused. I usually retopologize like arms completely on their own, except maybe like this whole part here. But yeah, like if you can reuse the hand that's already been retopologized properly, then yeah, that should save a lot of time. There is an area of topology I think that I do regret around here though, and that's actually at this sort of like the arms here. I ended up having to divide this more in the low poly. You'll see that they are like quite similar in terms of their structural makeup, like they're just kind of tight though. I think that this area here was a mistake. You're seeing how this like triangle here is being formed, right? Well, that's where this geometry is having to accommodate for the amount of polys in the arm, and maybe I should just give it that extra detail, or change the amount of polygons elsewhere. Probably would have just been better just to let the arm have that detail there. But it's not too bad. But at the same time, over here, I've had to basically add more topology because the actual arm needed it for animation. And the amount that I had here originally, which I think was about 2 loops there, wasn't really enough to contain it. So there is that. Okay. We'll take that back out. So, alright. So in terms of clothing, I think that this has gone okay, but there are more folds and better folds and more defined folds I think that I should have done. And I really should have studied that one artist that I now can't remember the name of. It always happens. You know, you know some artists pretty well, and then you go on stream, and then you just suddenly forget about him. That's so frustrating. But they're, you know, you'll know the cloth fold artist, so to speak. Yeah, I will find his name, but basically, there is this particularly strong like cloth fold artist that is referenced a lot by Team Fortress and Overwatch art actually. In that they take really great inspiration from him because he has all the folds, but you know he has the really important folds. And when they simplify those folds, they have a lot of character. I'll figure the name. I will have to find that. But if I recall right, he is an artist that draws for fashion. A lot of his work tends to be used for fashion. Okay. So, and there are some like folds here that I think may have been should have been better researched. So this here doesn't make that much sense now when I think about it. And that what I wanted to do was to do this sort of like bunching and tightening where this like ribbon ties around. But I don't think it's conveyed that. Likewise, like, you know, stuff around here I don't think has made as much sense as it should have. And it's a bit lumpy. This part here seems to have good intention in that there should be bunching and like tightness around here, but it doesn't quite convey what it's supposed to. That's what I think. And then there's some folds here that again should be referenced by that artist I can't remember the name of. Okay. This area here is what I believe is called a puff sleeve, and puff sleeves tend not to have this kind of form, or at least the shoulders don't have that much fullness, and really that most of the it depends how much fabric there is and where the weight of it lies. So this could have probably been researched a little bit more, but we went by the art reference instead for the concept art. Now these frills I think actually work really well though. But there is a problem, and this problem was basically present more for low poly. So these frills attach obviously to these, you know, straps, but the straps are modeled but attached to the this dress model, right? So all of this is part of this upper body model, but these are separate items. So skinning this was actually really difficult. I don't think it's something that you can really work around too well, other than by using proxy geometry, I guess. But the actual, well, I say using proxy geometry, I more mean that the proxy geometry then has to be bound to whatever is attached to these sleeves, or rather, the bones that these frills are attached to should really be mapped to, like, they should be influencing the shoulder as well. But they can't really. They can't because the shoulder doesn't rotate according to that. So it was a very tricky one where we needed these frills to be able to move, but they have to be influenced at the same amount as this, basically this area for each one, right? So you got a bone here and a bone here, then this bone has to have the same influences around roughly this area. And that's difficult to determine, and I don't think that copyright weights was necessarily clever enough to deduce that, and you know, I don't think it would be able to anyway. I think there were some other ways I could have gone about trying to fix that, but in the end I kind of ended up having to kind of guesstimate it a little bit with the weights, and area like clusters at the bottom of the this band had to be bound to one of the spine skeleton pieces instead of the shoulder, so that it didn't rotate with it. It was very difficult, but I'm sure that there would have been a much easier way of going about that, and I hope to find that out for next time. Okay, what else have we got here? What else can we talk about? Yeah, which is a little slow when you don't interact with it for a while. Okay, so all of this aspect basically, is kind of fine. I think that's okay. I think this part, which is one of the parts I ended up reworking pretty hard, just to like do these folds. I think it's okay, but like, at the same time, what with any kind of fold study, these needed improvement in how realistic, I guess, the folds should behave. No, I don't think these behave particularly realistically, in that the pinching points are at the top and at the top parts here. Right, so these are like the anchor points, and then the cloth falls to form this. But at the same time, it has to not overlap the skirt, right? It shouldn't go through the skirt. That's a bit difficult. So it kind of ends up looking a little flat. I mean, it's okay. It's not an immense problem or anything, but it still kind of has a little bit of like a sort of point by point. I think that one of the reasons for that is just the rig and the skinning. And the final like problem with this is over here. And I think this is where our topology has kind of let us down a little bit, in that this is kind of straight like that. But when we look at the way that this form works, so this curve moves around like this. But our topology then tends to lump over like that, right? So it's a conflict of directions. And if it were to be properly represented, what should happen is that we should be having a strip of polygons basically forming from there. Obviously that can be more work or more expensive, but it would probably look a lot better. So our mileage kind of really varies there, but what particularly hurts, because these polys are kind of trying to move in this kind of way, they basically mess up some normals. Even though we've got projected normals, at the same time, when we go to move these vertices around via, bone manipulation, you see that we start getting weird lighting here and here. That's because, of course, the actual form of the model is being bent in a way that doesn't represent the high poly. So that's what you get. That's why that happens here. So the way to improve this one is to just simply, retopologize this according to the geometry that's present in the high poly. In other words, follow the curves. But of course, the only problem with this is that it doesn't really work so well with our sort of idea of trying to reuse as much of the high poly's lowest subdivision as possible. So in a case like this, we actually have to retopologize it. With this mesh in particular, we actually did use the lowest subdivision. So if we were to, file this back, well, not quite the lowest, I think it would have been second lowest, right? Something like this. And you see there already, right, that it's already betraying. And you can tell because it's, getting this sort of voxelated look when we're at the lowest subdivision, and that's what you expect of when you're sculpting normally. That aspect is, fine and dandy. But to you, like, this is why, you're told not to reuse these, because of course the form doesn't really convey the high poly. So, and then as we go up, we start getting closer to, the actual highest poly form, obviously. But it costs, the amount of polys to do that, like the fidelity here, is obviously nuts. So to try and do this with a low poly that flows the wrong way can be kind of a little bit problematic. I mean, it's not too bad, but it just means that areas like this risk a particular like lighting issue. That's what I think. One area, of course, I think is something that I can't even fight or argue is this like series of frills on this skirt here. I think that's worked absolutely beautifully, much more than I thought it would. But it did take a very long time to retopologize this. Actually, I had went through every single one of these and retopologized by hand. That is not the best of practices. And I think that there could have been at least some way to make that a little faster. But because this comes from a brush, but it's a very, very kind of complicated mesh, it's hard to say if you could really simplify this easily. In some cases here, when we look at it from, reasonable distance like this, we don't really notice that actually some of these are like kind of filled like that. You don't really notice it, and that's fine. As long as it's consistent with that, it's probably okay. Right? Because it just looks like, it's folding normally. So, yeah, I would call that one a win. It's especially a win because frills are very, very complicated and annoying and require, a very sort of interesting work process to be able to do efficiently. They still have all their own UV space though, so they are quite greedy. But maybe there's a way, for instance, if we have like a brush that has its own UVs, maybe we can do something where we simplify it a little, perhaps, and it has its own UV data, maybe. I don't know. I'm just sort of throwing ideas there. I'll just have to see about that one. I particularly like the way that the shadow actually is rendered over on this, because it gives it that sense of like real depth, like that this apron piece is quite thick and overlaps over the frill part, which is sewn or stitched to it. I guess that's one piece. One thing I didn't really do very much of was stitching detail. Maybe I should have done that. Maybe I should have like shown that there's like stitching here. But on the other hand, would an apron really have that kind of stitch there? I mean, it's already kind of folded over. Maybe it's not that appropriate. And I guess like the final like super cheat here, right? That I'm super guilty of. This area is not double-sided. Everything else is, but for whatever reason, this particular set of meshes is not. No, I've got no real answer to that. I probably should have just made it double-sided, and it probably wouldn't have been as much work as I thought it would have been. It would literally just be a case of duplicating this over, flip the faces, inset a little, attach them at the bottom, job done. I think that that was something that I should have probably just done and not worried too much about the actual poly count for it. Oh, by the way, the poly count for this is just over 100,000, so it's quite expensive. But with this many frills, and I think that game characters are kind of becoming more expensive by the day anyway. It's not. I don't think it's the worst thing, but there are, definitely examples where you can do super high detailed characters and still have them quite low in their poly count. It's quite interesting. Okay. Oh yeah, and perhaps this is a happy little accident, but over here, you see that the ribbon is pointed downwards, it's quite natural. But on the rig, I had to kind of jimmy this up to straighten it out and make it face 90 degrees. Well, the thing about the A pose render for this character, or neutral pose, is it actually has it pointed down as well. That's the reason for that is because it was retopologized downwards. But in the skinning, we had to rotate it back up to straighten it out. Not sure that's the best work practice, but at least it made the A pose more natural and meant that I didn't have to like rotate two ribbons down. So I guess that's a plus. But all for the wrong reasons. I suppose in reality, what you would probably do is that you would probably just model it straight. But the issue with that is that you might lose some sort of natural curvature to that, because of course you've modeled it straight. So when it goes to curve, it's only going to curve based on what it's got, which is usually bones and a given amount of polygons. So I guess it's arguable either way, which way that could go. And I guess finally here on this ZBrush model is the shoes. Now it's not like most of this mesh was particularly detailed anyway, but the shoes in particular were reworked to have this sort of outer casing, so to speak, that is stitched on. And obviously the stitches are there's just a super basic brush where you take a donut, rip it in half, and then that's your brush, and you just curve it across over like this. It's not difficult at all, but it's effective. Add that to Substance Painter with the way that these areas are cavitied and adjusted and painted and such with the the sort of shadowing, and you get what I think is pretty effective in terms of demonstrating this form, right? It really does look like there is some real depth to it. That's because there is, but when you look at the actual form of it, on the low poly there is not. This is a very, very simple low poly. Might be easier if I would actually turn the wireframe on like this. Maybe a little brighter. Maybe a little darker like this, or... Not sure which one works. We'll try white. Like this, right? So, you see how... I consider this, very good in terms of that it represents a really complicated model, but with way less polygons, and the fact that they don't even have to necessarily float. But there's a massive issue, and this issue is this. This is a projection issue. And the reason why this has happened, as I recall, is that there is an area here which has been unwrapped in a very problematic way. So, the reason why this happens is because the edge here does not match this face where this edge is does not match the dimensions and rotation of this face and this edge here. So in order for these two to be joined correctly, in order for these areas to be rendered correctly, these edges must be joined, or at the very least they must be proportioned correctly. If they're not, then all the data gets lost in this face, because of course it's being contorted. And far away, when we look at that, it's not the worst thing in the world, but it is a very obvious blip there, which is a bit of a shame. Kind of messed with that a little bit, but in terms of actually fixing it, what I would do next time, well, just taking a look at the wireframe again, this then should tell you where you need to split UVs on your model. And I think that instead of trying to hide them all in this edge here, what I think needed to happen was that this shoe needed to be split here perhaps, and on the other side. So it needed to be a complete full split, right? And then the area where this possibly happens should then be split maybe here, right? So that way you're not trying to join, I guess, an area that's in plain view and plain sight, but also it's an area where there are hard edges, and an area with hard edges doesn't have weird normals. So, and what with baking a normal map, you kind of need your normals to be in a good spot, but of course they're not here. The actual texture space is very, very distorted in comparison to the other face. That's why that happens. I should do a UV map in Maya, perhaps, actually. Actually, this covers most of the feedback I have here and the feedback that I have for myself for this high poly. So I'd say that's good enough information. So let's move on to Maya then. So the character was mostly fully rigged. Now there's only one spot that isn't fully rigged, and it's this whole face here. The essence of that is that I basically ran out of time, so I wanted to try and make it for the rookies, but unfortunately this area kind of had to like suffer a little bit. So there's some parts that are mapped, like this mouth here is actually kind of okay if I only rotate the jaw, but if I were to look at the that's the master skeleton for this, right? And if I find the face controls that I was working on, you'll find that it doesn't quite work because it's not finished. So I was messing around with the left eyelid, and I was running into problems where some stuff wasn't bound or mapping correctly. So you see how that area there is moving even though I'm moving the left eyelid. Yes, it's a particular frustration that I had. Likewise over here where I look at the way this eyelid closes, mostly okay except for a skinning issue here and a skinning issue there. Basically they don't have the correct values, so I needed to find a way to get these values more uniform, right? And over here as well, this is just using full weighting quite clearly, so it just rotates according to the bone as a, you know, and I can't really adjust for it, which is obviously not what I want. But every other aspect, and I think I've talked about way too much length on stream and stuff, and there's a whole like, you know, video demo of me going through just messing around with stuff on the art station, I think, and the rookies post, is that there's like, you know, just loads of stuff where these systems do actually kind of work. So it would be nice if there's the where's the rotation tool on? Oh, rotation tool is apparently not here today. Oh, that's a bit annoying. Okay, that's a new one. Let's do the rotation tool. Fine, we'll reset Maya at some point. That's a bit annoying. But maybe it'll be in the no, there's no all tool here. Oh well, whatever. Okay, so meh, that's just what happens. But the point being is that these controls all do work. I've got the demo of that where they do actually work, so I don't need to prove myself again and repeat what I've been saying a good few times. But what I will say is that you can look at the UVs of the this mesh here, and just get the 2-panel view actually. Okay, so over on this shoe here, most of that's unwrapped, but the problem is that these edges will never align to these edges here. So this cut probably should have been around here, and what would have been good is if we'd cut along this series of edges. So this would have been to around here. So if we had cut this, this might have made for this area to be a little bit better. I mean, it would still never ever be perfect because they're always going to be mapped a bit differently. But at the very least, it would give this area some breathing room. Maybe even cut it along here. Right? So if we cut it along here and then relax it, these two edges there would have a much better chance of lining up, so that it would make it way less obvious that there is an issue there. You know, it's just because there's so little space over there that any kind of texture scale issue or paint issue will show up with, you know, it will show up very easily. So there is that. Oops. Okay. And there was this issue here that I wanted to talk about a little bit. So if I were to just find the shoulder controls somehow, oh yeah, it's here. So, oh yeah, I can't rotate it this way. I've got to rotate it this way, like this. Not this one. Right, so you see how when I move this shoulder, that this area gets kind of stretched and the rest of them kind of just full of follow? Well, that's one of the major issues I had, where these bottom vertices wouldn't really play nicely with the bones, or rather the skinning that the body had. So one thing I tried was to copy the weights of the body to these frills. Now it worked, but I then had to redo all the skinning that I had on here. Not only this, but then you have the added difficulty of not trying to overwrite the pasted UVs you've got. Now, of course, there is always the locking of the weights, but there's still always going to be that problem where you need them to blend more, and you can't do that because you've locked them, so you have to then unlock them, and that's when the fun begins, where you accidentally start removing your own weights. So, fun times ahead there. Yeah, frills are really, really, really difficult. However, one thing that could potentially have worked is if I had skinned like a bit of proxy shoulder, perhaps, so somewhere around here, like, if I had skinned that, and then skinned clusters, like pinned clusters to the vertices, and then those clusters drive the bones, like these bones over here on the, one sec, yeah, over on the shoulder frills here. So I've got these, right? So if I had maybe clusters that were pinned to vertices here, and then these clusters were had these bones parented to them, so one here perhaps, and then from there you can then bind the controls to the bones, and so when you move the shoulder, or whichever way that the shoulder moves, then the bones would just simply follow along, and it would be just a simple positioning skin. I think that's what I should have done. And I'm just a little miffed that I didn't think of it, and I had, deadline coming up. So I opted for something a little bit quicker, which was just, okay, detach these two from the shoulder area so that they don't move along with it. And now my transform control apparently came back. Oh, it's there, okay, whatever. So now they move. But it's all kind of, it's all still kind of very one-to-one with those bones, and then the frill kind of has to share the amount of influence with the spine bones here, or the shoulder bone. So it was very, very complicated and annoying, and I think that if I had like a little bit more time, I could have implemented something like the cluster solution that I just mentioned. That would probably have been the way to go with that. But, what's done is done. And I think that's pretty important. Okay. Alright, so that's all fine. The skirt works pretty well, surprisingly well. There's still issues where if you go too far with it, it can kind of what's that one? Like if you go too far with it, it's going to overlap, but that's just part of the course really. And obviously there's no physics on it, you have to actually position it. But for basic posing, it's fine, and that's all we really needed it for. So that's okay. And the rig is actually reusable, mostly reusable anyway. Like at the very least, all of the pieces are in place, and they have controls. Apart from the face, but that'll be the next character's problem. And yeah, but hopefully, because there's so much progress here made with this whole rig, then the next character that we do this for will have an easy time being rigged and skinned with this, and then they get the the experience of having the face skin probably to make face controls and all of that stuff. So plus there's a whole bunch of like tutorials I've got on Pluralsight that I can go through with that, which I did actually do, but implement here we did not. Okay, so that basically covers everything I think I wanted to really talk about in terms of this evaluation. Overall, I would say that this character has been quite successful, and I've learned a lot. And yeah, there are mistakes with the model, but I think that with every model that I've made, the amount of mistakes is being reduced, and the severity of the mistakes is going, better, right? So hopefully for the next one, we're going to see way less mistakes, and we're going to see, mistakes that are more easily fixed. And the easier they are to fix, then of course, they disappear. In terms of the actual scope of the model, though, perhaps that could be increased a little bit more, so that we've got something that renders really well, but also poses really well, and gets more views basically. So, well, I think that this is a good start. This is a good model that could be put on portfolio, and it is. So there is that. So for actual next project, then I'm still kind of thinking about that a little. I'm not sure exactly what exactly I want to do with it. With the next project, I mean, not totally sure, but I don't think I have to worry too much about things like frills and stuff, because I think it's pretty clear that the methodology that I've got works really well for them. So there's no need to like shy away from difficult concepts like that. So maybe we'll do I don't know, an idol or something. Maybe. Not super sure. But one thing I do want to do before we do any kind of work on a new character is that I want to make some pieces that actually function. So some helpful tools, or brushes and stuff that are gonna help out with this. And I also want to try and make this whole base mesh into low poly starting point thing a reality as well. So maybe those things are something that I would stream. So basically, I think to start with, we'll try doing some hair pieces that could be starting as a low poly sort of mesh that then can be sculpted on, still retain their UVs, and then when I want to make their low poly, it would just be a case of importing their lowest subdiv into Maya and moving the UVs around, really. I think that's what we'll do. So, okay. What I think my plan then is that tomorrow is going to be a day of like basically a break, so there won't be a stream. But on a Thursday, we're going to start making basically tools. So these streams should hopefully be short little, well, not really short, but little one-off kind of streams where we just sort of make tools that hopefully help with this process, I think. Well, we'll see. It's going to be a fun little experiment anyway. So if you've got any feedback on this model, or you have any particular thoughts as to what looks good, what looks bad, well, to improve it, whatnot, please go right ahead and feel free to leave any kind of comment on that below. Anyways, that's it for today. Just wanted to do a bit of a post-mortem or evaluation on this project, and I think it's gone well. I think there's parts to improve, but as I say, the amount of things to improve and the amount of the severity of the problems decreases with each model. So, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you next time, where I'll go ahead and start making some ZBrush hair pieces, I think. Yep. Alrighty then. See you next time.